The old Ford F-1 Passat rolled slowly down a back road, its cabin rattling with every bump and crack in the pavement. The sounds, metal creaks, a low hum of the engine, blended together into something oddly comforting, like the familiar chorus of a well-worn song. Henry gripped the steering wheel with both hands, squinting against the late afternoon sun that spilled across the windshield. Beside him, Margaret adjusted the scarf around her neck, and in the back, Buddy, their loyal mutt, stuck his nose out the open window, tongue lolling, tail thumping against the seat in pure delight. "Do you remember," Henry said, his voice touched with amusement, "when every road trip felt like an adventure? Even stopping for gas seemed exciting back then." Margaret smiled, glancing sideways at him. Her eyes had that familiar sparkle, half teasing, half tender. "For you, Henry, I suspect even a trip to the grocery store was an adventure. I can only imagine what you were like at 20. Henry laughed. The sound was deep, roughened by years, yet alive, carrying within it the vigor he had thought long gone until recently. Then, just around a bend, a weathered sign appeared. The paint had all but peeled away, but the faint outline of letters could still be made out. Parking. Below the sign stretched a wide, cracked lot. Faded white lines peeked through tufts of weeds, and old steel awnings leaned like tired shoulders against the weight of decades. Margaret tilted her head. "Want to stop?" "Of course," Henry nodded, already pulling the wheel. Places like this don't show themselves often. It's like time leaves them behind for people like us to stumble upon. The truck rumbled onto the lot, tires crunching over gravel that had long since broken free from asphalt. Henry killed the engine, and the sudden quiet was almost startling. Once, long ago, this parking lot must have been alive. Families piling out of station wagons, kids racing towards soda machines, teenagers leaning against their cars blasting music from tinny speakers. Now it stood in silence, a relic of another era. A faded vending machine, rust creeping along its sides, leaned near the ends like a forgotten sentinel. The wind whistled through torn fabric awnings, making them creak and sway like old bones. Buddy leapt out the moment Henry opened the door, paws scratching against the ground as he bounded into the empty space. Nose to the ground, tail wagging, he explored every crack and shadow, as though intent on resurrecting whatever life had once lingered here. Margaret fell into step beside Henry, her hand brushing against his as they walked slowly between rows of ghostly parking spaces. Her eyes roamed over the ruins with a curious melancholy. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes I think places like this exist just so we remember, like they hold memories for us when we've forgotten them ourselves." Henry stopped beneath one of the sagging awnings, resting a hand against a flaking steel column. He could almost hear echoes, shouts of boys in their prime, the blare of radios, the rustle of summer nights. "Back when I was 20, he began, "I stopped at lots like these all the time. Me and the guys would drive west with hardly a dime in our pockets. We slept in the truck, sang along to the radio, thought the world was waiting just for us. Everything felt possible." He looked at her then, a wry smile tugging at his mouth. "And here I am again, driving west, only this time I'm not chasing a dream. I think I'm driving with it." Margaret felt her chest tighten. She slipped her arm through his, leaning closer as they walked. Silence stretched comfortably between them, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps and Buddy's distant bark as he discovered something of interest near the far fence. At the edge of the lot, half buried in weeds, stood an old rusted mailbox, leaning like it had one foot in the grave. Margaret, curious, pulled the door open. Inside, nearly turned to dust, lay a forgotten magazine. Its cover was sun-faded, edges curled, but still visible. A smiling family in bright 1970s clothes beneath bold letters. "The American Road. Freedom awaits." Margaret laughed softly and handed it to Henry. "Now that's a sign if I've ever seen one." Henry traced the cover with his thumb, his expression thoughtful. "Freedom awaits. Seems like it still does." He tossed the brittle magazine gently back inside, as if laying it to rest. Then, together, they turned back toward the truck. Buddy came bounding to meet them, tail wagging furiously, tongue lolling in joy. His bark echoed off the empty lot, filling it with life for the first time in who knew how many years. Henry started the engine, and the roar of the old Ford spread across the silence like a proclamation. The cracked asphalt, the rusted structures, the faded memories, it all seemed to wake for a heartbeat, stirred by the presence of the living. As they rolled back toward the open road, the sun dipped lower, catching in the truck's windows and scattering across the glass in fiery bursts. Henry gripped the wheel tighter, eyes on the horizon. "So," he said, a grin tugging at his lips, "shall we keep going?" Margaret's hand found his. "Yes," she said. Her voice was firm, warm, sure. "I think this road has only just begun." And with that, the Ford carried them onward, leaving behind the ghosts of the past, but carrying its lessons in their hearts, heading west toward canyons, toward oceans, toward everything still waiting to be lived. Word count, decent set. The next morning, the Ford rumbled back to life with its familiar growl, echoing through the quiet of the roadside motel where they had spent the night. The old sign outside, its neon long dead, buzzed faintly in the dawn breeze, a ghost of its former glow. Henry checked the mirrors, shifted into gear, and eased the truck back onto the highway. The road stretched endlessly before them, a ribbon of faded blacktop cutting through scrubland that shimmered in the morning light. Margaret sat with a paper cup of coffee, her fingers curled around its warmth, watching the desert unfold. Buddy had his head out the window again, ears flapping like little flags of joy. Henry turned on the radio. Static first, then the thin voice of a DJ announcing golden oldies all morning long. A familiar guitar riff spilled out, the Beatles' "Here Comes the Sun." Margaret laughed softly. "Well," she said, "that feels about right." Henry tapped the steering wheel in rhythm, his voice rough but tuneful as he began to sing along. "Little darling, it's been a long, cold, lonely winter." Margaret joined him, her voice lighter, weaving with his. For a moment, the truck became a capsule of warmth, carrying their shared melody through the desert. They drove in companionable silence for a while after the song ended, the road bending lazily through red earth and scattered mesquite trees. From time to time, they passed weathered diners or rusting billboards. One, its paint nearly erased, still declared, "See America first! Take Route 66!" Henry slowed as they came to a crossroads. A small roadside stand sat nearby, a lone figure arranging jars of honey and baskets of oranges. "Feel like a stop?" he asked. Margaret smiled. "Why not? It wouldn't be a real trip if we didn't buy something we don't need." They pulled over. The man at the stand was wiry, suntanned, his cowboy hat pushed back. His face lit up when he saw Buddy jump from the truck. "That's a fine dog you've got there," he said, scratching Buddy behind the ears. "Got some local honey here, good for the soul. And these oranges, sweet as summer itself." Margaret bought both, insisting on paying extra. As they drove away, she peeled an orange, filling the cabin with citrus scent. She held out a slice to Henry. "Here, for the driver of this fine chariot." He accepted with a grin, juice dripping down his thumb. "Now that tastes like the road." By midday, the land began to change. Flat scrub gave way to hills, then to rocky outcroppings that rose like sleeping giants. The sky seemed to grow wider, its blue deepening, as if preparing them for the grandeur ahead. Henry slowed as the road wound into tighter curves. "We're getting close. Can you feel it?" Margaret looked out at the widening vistas. "It feels like we're driving straight into a painting." The first glimpse of the canyon came suddenly, after a bend. A vast expanse opened before them, cliffs dropping into shadowy depths, the far side glowing red and gold under the afternoon sun. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Oh, Henry!" He pulled the truck onto a gravel overlook and killed the engine. They sat in silence for a long moment, both struck dumb by the immensity of it. The canyon spread endlessly, layers of stone like the pages of an ancient book, each colored line telling a story millions of years old. Buddy barked, impatient, and leapt from the truck. Henry chuckled and got out, stretching his legs. He helped Margaret down, and together they walked to the railing. The wind rose from the depths, warm and dry, carrying with it the smell of dust and pine. Henry leaned on the railing, eyes tracing the horizon. "I remember seeing this once when I was 21. Drove all night to get here. Thought I'd never see anything more beautiful." Margaret's hand slipped into his. "And now," he turned to her, eyes soft, "now I know the company matters more than the view." Her eyes glistened, and for a moment neither spoke. Instead they stood together, small figures before an ancient wonder, letting the silence of the canyon speak for them. Later, they spread a blanket on the hood of the Ford. Margaret poured coffee from the thermos, and they shared the honey and oranges bought that morning. Buddy curled at their feet, content. The sun shifted, painting the cliffs in deeper shades of crimson and violet. Margaret leaned back, her head against Henry's shoulder. "You know," she said, "I thought trips like this were for younger people, for the ones still chasing dreams. But now, it feels like we've been given another chance." Henry kissed her hair. "We're not chasing anymore. We're living it." As twilight approached, the first stars began to prick the darkening sky. They packed up slowly, not wanting to leave, but knowing the road was calling again. Henry started the Ford, headlights cutting across the desert. The canyon faded in the mirrors, but its presence lingered within them, as though they carried a piece of it in their hearts. Margaret hummed softly as they drove, a tune Henry recognized. "California Dreamin'." He joined in, their voices blending, a harmony against the hum of tires on the road. For miles they sang together, laughter spilling between verses. And when the music ended, Henry reached over, took her hand, and held it against the wheel. Ahead, the road stretched westward, toward the promise of the ocean. The desert highway stretched like a ribbon of faded asphalt, wavering under the late afternoon heat. Henry's hands rested steady on the wheel, his gaze fixed forward. The hum of the engine, the steady rhythm of tires on the road, and the occasional bark from Buddy in the back seat formed the soundtrack of their journey. "Feels like we're the only ones out here," Margaret said, peering at the empty landscape. "Just us and the horizon." Henry chuckled. "That's how I like it. No rush, no crowds, just the road." The Ford carried them westward until the sun began to lower, staining the sky with shades of orange and violet. A weather-beaten sign appeared on the side of the road, its letters barely legible. "Rest stop, 2 miles." Henry slowed, curiosity piqued. The place, when they reached it, was not the tidy picnic spot Margaret had imagined. Instead, it was a vast, forgotten parking lot, cracked with weeds, surrounded by the skeletal remains of lampposts. Once, long ago, buses must have pulled in here, travelers stretching their legs before continuing west. Now only silence remained, broken by the whisper of wind and the crunch of gravel beneath their tires. Henry parked near the faded outline of an old painted arrow that still pointed toward nothing. He cut the engine. For a moment, the world seemed suspended, as if time itself had chosen to linger here. Margaret opened her door and stepped out. The air smelled faintly of dust and sage. She walked a few paces, the sound of her shoes echoing eerily in the emptiness. "It's like a ghost town," she said softly. Henry joined her, flashlight in hand. "Places like this used to be alive," he murmured. "Families stopping on their way to California, kids running around with candy bars and sodas. Now it's just us." Buddy darted ahead, nose twitching, tail wagging. He seemed unbothered by the melancholy of the place. Instead, he bounded toward an old vending machine standing crooked against the wall of a crumbling restroom building. Its paint was peeling, the glass cracked, but inside, the faint outline of candy wrappers still clung to the slots. Henry tapped the glass with a finger. "Imagine the last person who bought a Coke here. Maybe in the 70s, maybe in the 80s. And now, here we are." Margaret smiled faintly. "Makes me wish we could step back, just for a moment." They walked together toward the far edge of the lot. Beyond the cracked pavement stretched a wide desert plain, the horizon glowing with the fire of the setting sun. The silence was immense, but instead of feeling empty, it seemed full of memory, of possibility, of every traveler who had once passed through. Henry spread a blanket on the hood of the Ford. From the cooler, he pulled out sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Margaret poured coffee into tin mugs. They ate slowly, watching the colors of the sky deepen, the first stars emerging one by one. Buddy curled beside them, content after a day of adventure. His steady breathing was the only sound. "It's strange," Margaret said, sipping her coffee. "This place is falling apart, abandoned, but somehow it feels right, like we were meant to find it." Henry nodded. "Sometimes the road gives you what you didn't know you were looking for." For a long while, they said nothing, letting the night settle around them. Crickets began their chorus, and a faint breeze carried the scent of creosote. The world outside their little circle of light seemed vast and unknowable, but here, on this forgotten patch of earth, they felt anchored. Henry reached for his guitar, the old case wedged behind the seat. He had brought it almost without thinking, unsure if he would ever use it. Now, under the desert sky, he felt the pull. He strummed a chord, the sound ringing out against the silence. Margaret looked at him, eyes wide. I didn't know you still played. Henry smiled sheepishly. Haven't in years, but tonight feels like the right time. He began to play softly, the familiar progression of a Beatles song, Let It Be. His voice, roughened by age, carried the words with unexpected strength. Margaret listened, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes glistening in the starlight. When he finished, she leaned closer. That was beautiful, Henry. You've been hiding this side of yourself. He shrugged. Maybe I'd just forgotten it was there. They sat together until the chill of night pressed in. Finally, Henry packed the guitar away, and they climbed back into the truck. Margaret leaned against him as the engine roared back to life. As they drove out of the forgotten lot, the headlights caught the old sign once more. Its faded letters seemed to glow briefly in the beam, as though bidding them farewell. Margaret whispered, half to herself, maybe places like that never really die. They just wait for someone to notice them again. Henry squeezed her hand. And we did. The road beckoned once more, stretching toward the promise of the ocean. The highway gradually gave way to the scent of salt on the air. It was faint at first, almost imagined, but as the miles rolled on, the smell grew stronger, fresh, sharp, alive. Margaret closed her eyes and breathed deeply, a smile spreading across her face. Henry, she said softly, we're close. I can feel it. Buddy barked from the back seat as if in agreement, tail thumping against the old upholstery. Henry grinned. Even he knows, the sea always gives itself away. The Ford crested a hill, and suddenly the horizon opened into endless blue. The ocean stretched wide and eternal, the afternoon sun scattering silver across its surface. Waves rolled rhythmically toward the shore, as though welcoming them home. Margaret gasped, pressing her hand to her lips. Oh, Henry, it's beautiful. He slowed the truck, letting the moment linger. Haven't seen it in years. Looks just the same, and completely different. They followed the coastal road until a small neon sign appeared, flickering weakly in the fading light. Sea Breeze Motel. Vacancy. Its letters buzzed like tired bees, but the building, though weathered, stood sturdy against the sea wind. Henry pulled in, gravel crunching beneath the tires. The motel's white stucco walls were streaked with salt, its windows reflecting the last blaze of sunset. A woman at the front desk, a gray-haired innkeeper with gentle eyes, handed them a key attached to a wooden fob. Room 6, Ocean View, she said with a smile. You folks picked a good evening. Tide's high tonight. They carried their bags inside, Buddy trotting happily at their heels. The room was simple, 2 chairs by the window, a quilted bedspread, the faint scent of sea and soap. But the view stole their breath. From the window, they could see the waves crashing against dark rocks, gulls wheeling above the foam. Margaret set her bag down and whispered, I could stay here forever. Henry moved beside her, his hand finding hers. Then let's make tonight last as long as it can. As twilight deepened, they walked together down the motel's wooden steps to the beach. The sand was cool beneath their shoes, damp with the memory of retreating waves. Buddy bounded ahead, chasing the surf, barking at the foam. The two of them strolled in silence for a time, the only sound the rhythmic crash of the ocean and the whisper of wind in their ears. The sky deepened from rose to indigo, stars flickering awake above them. Margaret turned to him. Do you remember when we were young and everything felt so far ahead of us? Tonight, it feels like it's all ahead again, like the tide turned back. Henry stopped, looking out over the restless sea. I think that's what the ocean does. It reminds you that everything keeps moving. The tide goes out, the tide comes back. Life can begin again, even when you think the best part has already passed. She slipped her arm through his. Then maybe this is our second tide. They found a driftwood log and sat, Buddy curling up at their feet. Henry reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a harmonica, worn smooth by time. He hadn't touched it in decades, but the sight of the waves had stirred something inside him. He lifted it to his lips and played softly, a tune carried on the wind. Margaret leaned against him, listening. The music mingled with the ocean's roar, the song and the sea becoming one. Her eyes shone with tears, though she smiled. When he finished, she whispered, You surprise me more every day. He kissed the top of her head. Guess I'm just getting started. They stayed there until the moon climbed high, painting the water silver. Then, hand in hand, they returned to the motel. The neon sign buzzed faintly above them, a fragile beacon against the night. Inside, the room was quiet except for the sound of the waves through the open window. They sat together, looking out, their silhouettes framed by the glow of the moon. Henry took her hand once more. "We made it, Margaret. The ocean, the end of the road, but maybe also the beginning of something new." She squeezed his hand, her voice steady and warm. "Then let's see where this tide takes us." Buddy sighed contentedly, curling into sleep. Beyond the glass, the waves rolled on, eternal and patient, carrying with them the promise of renewal.